Hey guys, I'm Yagesh Bobre and welcome to Developer Zone. Today we are going to be seeing and learning about serverless architecture, what AWS Lambda functions are, and how do we create our own Lambda function, right? Let's start with the server first. So let's take an example. Let's say you are a backend developer, you write some code, you create your own APIs, right? And you can write your code in whatever language you prefer. It can be Python, it can be a framework like Node.js, anything, right? But for that code to run, you need a server, right? If you're using and taking an example of AWS, you'll create an EC2 instance. If you don't know what it is, that's fine, that's totally fine. But basically, it's a virtual server that's run on cloud, right? Let's actually see what it looks like to create an EC2 instance in Amazon. Click on launch instances to create your own, right? And you see, it asks for the name of the server that you want. Then it asks for the application of the OS, right? So all of this is configurable when you're setting up your own EC2 instance, your own server. Right? And you can configure everything, shared instances, dedicated. And for that, the price is 0.018 for per hour. This is the hourly rate, right? So 0.0182. What if the number of users, the traffic increases over time? What happens then? So at that time, you might use something like auto scaling groups to manage or upscale your server, right? So what happens is when you're using servers, you have to manually configure every setting like OS, the memory, the CPU, and you have to upscale and downscale yourself. So let's look at the alternative, that is the serverless architecture. Now, serverless, what exactly is it? So as the name suggests, it's serverless, right? You don't have a server. You don't, what happens is, instead of configuring all this, what happens if I just give the code, right? What happens is you just give the code what you want to run, right? And it will configure everything, the OS, the memory, the CPU, what kind of how much it will utilize, it will scale according to your needs, and so on and so forth. The pricing for this is calculated based on the number of instances. What I mean by that is, like, for example, I've written a piece of code to get weather data, right? Just understand that if you're not familiar with programming, just that's what this block of code does. So now that I've written this code, I put that in a serverless architecture. What happens is it right now it is on a stop state. Okay, it's not running. What happens in a server architecture is it's running continuously, right? But in serverless, it's on a stop state first, and when it is called, like when a user comes to my website and he wants to see the data, so when a user comes, then he requests for this particular block, right? So a user came onto my site, he requested this, and the server started. So from the stop state, it got converted to started on the particular invocation. When the user came, it got started, right? So that's what happens in serverless. And after it gave the response, it automatically shuts down. So that's one invocation. If we actually see the pricing for Lambda functions, you'll see that it's 0.2 dollars per 1 million requests, and each request is this particular cycle. A user comes, but what happens if the number of users increases? Like, for example, let's say for now, just say 10 users came in. AWS will create simultaneously. So this will be run simultaneously for the 10 users. Their request will be handled parallelly so that there is no delay. So serverless architecture automatically handles that scaling factor for us, right? You didn't have to actually try and create our own Lambda function, so that it's easier to understand, right? So let's get back to our AWS console, and here let's search for Lambda. So this is the Lambda console that we see, and let's actually create a function. So I'll name it as low. Let's just go with the normal settings. We don't hit Control S to save the changes and hit on deploy. That's how easy it is to deploy the Lambda function on the internet. Now it's deployed on the internet, but we've already studied, like if you study programming in any language, you'll know that when you for a function, there are two important things. First is the declaration of the function, and then the second is the invocation, to call a function, right? Without calling a function, it's just some lines that are written which are not executing, so there's no point, right? So right now this code is written, but we are not calling it, we are not running this code, right? So to run that code, we have to add a trigger, so that when this trigger occurs, this function should run. So we'll add a trigger, and the trigger could be anything. It can be like a cron job. So like, for example, I want to run this particular code every single day at 12 o'clock. Right now we'll use API gateway because it's a API based approach. Like, for example, if I go to that URL, this particular function will be run. And I'll click on add. So what happens is, right now the API gateway creates an API. You'll see you get an API endpoint right here. And when we go to this endpoint, I'll copy that, and let's see it in Postman. So here is the Postman workspace. I'll just create a new request and I'll paste in the URL. And when I click on send, you'll see the response that I get is hello from Lambda. That's what the function that we wrote, right? So it's that simple. So these are all the factors basically that you might consider while choosing a server and serverless architecture, right?